Okay. Hello to everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's talk for MindCORE at the University of Pennsylvania. My name is Heather Calvert, and I'm the Executive Director for MindCORE. Our seminar series this year is focused on big unanswered questions about the mind. And today we are joined by Nick Chater from the Warwick School of Business, who will be introduced by Sudeep Bhatia. A recording of this talk will be available shortly after we end the session. And I just want to go over a couple of little housekeeping matters. One of which is you're welcome to post a question for our speaker using the Ask a Question menu at the bottom of your screen. And you can also vote on questions that have been posted there. And the questions that have the most votes usually are the ones that are asked first and are definitely asked if there are a lot of questions. And this is our last talk for the fall semester, but we will be back in February of next year. We're working to put together that schedule now, but if you use the, if you follow us above, then you will hear about when the new talks come up. So that's all for me. I'm going to turn it over to Sudeep.
All right. Thanks, Heather. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Nick Chater. He's a professor of behavioral science at the University of Warwick. Nick's had tremendous impact in the cognitive sciences, primarily by developing and popularizing ideas of probabilistic rationality, and then applying them to domains like reasoning, language, memory. More recently, he's begun to work on decision-making and behavioral economics, and has been instrumental in applying ideas from cognitive science and psychology to more applied problems in policy and business. And for this work and his other work, he's won numerous awards. He's a fellow of the British Academy and the Cognitive Science Society. On a more personal note, I will also mention that I had the pleasure of working with him, or well, alongside him, when I was a postdoc at the University of Warwick many years ago. I was studying economic decision-making. Well, just as Nick has kind of been moving from, say, cognitive science to perhaps a little bit more decision-making, I feel that my career is moving in the opposite direction. And one reason for that is the work that Nick has done at the intersection of these fields. So I find him to be a major influence in my own intellectual development. All right, so I'll end the intro here, and I'll let Nick take over. He's going to be talking to us about virtual bargaining.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sudeep. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've given a talk at UPenn once before, and I think that was probably 15 years or so ago. And it was a great pleasure. I really enjoyed it hugely. So this will be obviously slightly more low key, but much less carbon burned in the process. It was wonderful to have Sudeep as a postdoc in our group, by the way, as you could probably guess. He was terrific. So I'm going to try and share my screen, which I think is going to be wonderfully straightforward. But let's just see. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to be talking for the next 50 minutes or so, or 45, I hope, about a theory that we've been developing at Warwick. So I've been working with Tigran Melkonian, now at the University of Alabama, who's a game theorist and economist, Jennifer Mischek, who's a psycholinguist, and Hossam Zaitoun, who's an organizational theorist. And we're interested in, what we hope is a big question about the mind, which is how do people interact with each other successfully? And crucially, how do they work in a collaborative fashion? And here I don't necessarily mean large-scale collaborations, though I wouldn't rule those out. I mean the kind of question of how do we manage to, as it were, pass each other in a corridor? How do we communicate using language in a way that's jointly understood by both of us? How do we engage in simple coordination problems, so that if we're trying to move a table, we don't both grab the same end? And these are really fundamental questions, I think. One of the things that makes humans very special, possibly even unique, according to some, such as Mike Tomasello, is our ability to do this kind of thing. So a really interesting question is what's the machinery underlying that? And there are a number of papers that you could look at, but I'll try and give you a kind of fun overview of the basic ideas without any technicalities. There is quite a mathematical sort of game theoretic element to this work, but I'm going to just skip over the technicalities and focus on the general points, which I think are actually probably more important. Virtual bargaining, what is it? I want to start by really just giving you an intuition for a style of reasoning that we all have, but we possibly don't really realize that we have. I have a slight technical challenge, which is how to advance my slides, which should be easy. Oh, there we go. So I'm going to start with examples, just to give you an intuition for what virtual bargaining can do. and how flexible it is, and how natural it is, and how we don't really think twice about it until you stop and wonder, what reasoning were we doing there? Well, how does that fit into our normal understanding of reasoning? Then I'm going to give some examples of virtual bargaining in action according to us. So one example is, as I've said, communication. I think it's fundamentally a matter of virtual bargaining, or you can set it in that framework anyway. Collaboration, and I then want to think about social interactions on a mini scale as kind of like tiny social contracts, the kind of thing that the great political theorists such as Hobbes and Rousseau and Rawls think about, but on a much more microscopic scale of individual social interactions. I will probably skip largely sketching a formal theory, and it's very sketchy anyway, so I won't get into that in great detail, but then I'll say a little bit about how virtual bargains may be one way into understanding how culture can develop. But examples first. Virtual bargaining in action. So here's a problem, which probably is unfamiliar to you, because it's sort of made up, but you'll be able to solve it very easily, and it's kind of weird that we can. So there are 11 of us, and each of us has to choose a 0 or a 1, and then we're going to add up all the numbers we choose. And if the sum of those numbers is even, we get nothing, but if the sum is odd, we all get a prize. So we've got no prisoner's dilemma, tricky issues here. We've all got the same incentive, and the same incentive is to all get a prize. So how are we going to do that? And almost everybody thinks immediately, well, obviously, if we all say 1, we'll be fine, won't we? That'll solve it. And this is true. But what are you thinking there? What you should be thinking is, oh, that's very remarkable, because actually, how many ways of solving this problem are there that give you an odd number? Well, there are 11 people. So there are 2 to the 11 possible permutations that will work, that are possible, and half of them will give you an odd number and half will give you an even number. So that's 2 to the 10, i.e. 1,024 possible solutions. So if you're a game theorist, you'd think, well, they're all good solutions. Why choose one? The puzzle is it's just blindingly obvious to us that one of them is a really good solution. So a solution which I say, well, person 1, I'm going to say 1, and the next person's going to say 0, and the next person's going to say 1, and so on and so on. But we'll make it add up to an odd number. That's hopeless, because we have no way of coordinating. We have no way of knowing who's person 1, who's person 2. But a simple story which says, let's all choose 1, we can all do that. So there's something very special, especially salient about that, and it makes it very easy for us to latch onto. But it doesn't fit very naturally into any kind of individualistic theory of reasoning, because everybody's behavior is contingent in its efficacy on the behavior of all the other people. So what we're really thinking is, let's do this. You're not thinking, what shall I do? I'm not thinking, what shall you do? I'm not thinking, what shall I do on the basis of what you'll do? That goes around in an infinite loop forever. What I'm really doing is thinking, what shall we do? Let's do this. This will work. Go and do it. I think an interesting corollary of this is the implications it has for our theories of responsibility. I won't talk more about this really, but I think it's an interesting point. Most theories of responsibility have the property that they look at what you did and ask what would have happened if you did something different, and how much you get praised or blamed is sort of dependent on that twist. Well, here's a departure from that. So, well, let's take the simple case. Suppose we take a case where 10 of us say 1 very sensibly, and one person who's just not paying any attention says 0, and we know nobody gets a prize. Well, obviously, we round on that person and say, what were you thinking? We had a perfectly good plan there, which obviously we didn't talk about because we're just working independently, just coordinating without needing to communicate or being able to. But you foolishly didn't realize the obvious plan, and they would feel bad. But what if 2 people fail to follow the plan? Then we do get a prize, because there are 9 of us saying 1, and everything's good. But we're still going to look at those people and say, what were you doing? That was a crazy thing to do. We got away with it because there were 2 of you idiots rather than 1. But I mean, that was ridiculous. Don't do that again. And each of them, according to most theories of responsibility, would say, well, you should be thanking me. If I hadn't said 0, we'd have got no prize. So any theory which is based on sort of local counterfactuals is going to fail for that sort of reason. So what you're really doing when you're praising or blaming people is you're saying, at least in contexts like this, is you're saying, what's our plan? What should we do? Did you follow it? Irrespective of whether things worked out badly or well. So we don't blame the person. If there were 10 of us saying 1 and 1 saying 0, the person who said 0, we're all rounding on this poor person and saying, look, you foolish person, why on earth did you do that? We had this great plan. You should have realized we can all follow this plan. We'd have got our prize. But they could, you might think, equally well to say to any other person, well, if you'd said 0 like me, we'd have been fine. And the reason that's not persuasive is that what's good or bad behavior depends on us. It's not about me, it's not about you, it's not about interactions of people, it's about us, it's about the unit. And there's a plan that the unit could have followed and somebody didn't. And that's where your responsibility is coming from in these sorts of problems. And lots of variations of this problem for time. I probably won't go into them really, but I just want to give you a hint. There are problems which are just unsolvable of the same kind. So if we had to if we got a prize for getting an odd number, but there's only 10 of us, then we're really in trouble. How are we going to solve that? And the answer is there is no way. And sometimes coordination just does fail, and it fails for sort of good, rational reasons. This isn't a theory which is going to explain how people can coordinate all the time. It's going to try to explain why coordination is easy when it's easy, because there's one unique good solution for us, and we should all follow it. But when there's no one good solution, then we're in trouble. But sometimes variations of that same problem suddenly look easy again. So supposing one of us is standing on our own and the other are in groups of 3, then as long as we know the arrangement, the one standing on their own think, well, I'm kind of special here. There's just me on my own. Maybe if I say 1 and everybody else doesn't, we'll be fine. And everyone else might think that too. But it's not completely clear. For example, it might be the case that that person thinks, well, I should say 0, and everybody else says 1. Oh, no, that's a possibility too. And that's going to make it a hard problem to solve. And let me skip over the next, but there are so many possibilities. Now, these are problems that people find very easy when they're doable. When they're not doable, of course, there's no solution, so they don't find it easy. But what's the logic behind them? And as I've already said, really what people are thinking here is they're thinking, trying to solve a problem of coordination like this, what we need to think about is what we could agree to do. What agreement could be jointly made such that if we followed it, we would succeed? And of course, this only works if it's not just me thinking this way, all of us thinking this way. So what we're thinking is something like, let's imagine what are we going to come? What conclusion would we come to collectively if we thought about this? And I know that whatever conclusion that is, it's the same conclusion other people are going to imagine. We're all going to think, well, obviously we've got to go 1 here. So that's the solution. I'll follow the plan. You all follow the plan. We all know what the plan is. It's common knowledge. Given our common knowledge, we can work out the best plan. So we just need to all follow it. We follow its recommendations, and then we succeed. So what virtual bargaining is doing is it's saying, if we can all anticipate what that agreement would be, we don't actually have to talk about it. We don't have to be able to talk about it. We just imagine what the agreement would be, and we follow that agreement. So the bargaining is purely virtual. There's no actual necessity for real sort of toing and froing and suggesting things and disagreeing and so on. We just do it virtually. Of course, sometimes that's not possible. We get problems like the one we talked about earlier with the 10 people. Then we have to talk. If we can talk, we'll say, well, actually, I'll say 1, everybody else do 0. Then it's very easy. But in lots of situations, of course, we can't talk. Okay, so what I want to do now is to give some examples. And the first one is communication, because I want to stress that you might think, well, virtual bargaining sounds like it might be very handy when we can't communicate. But how often does that happen? Well, the answer is A, communication is always very partial. Another point B would be communication is always very unspecified, so we have to do a lot of reasoning to actually work out what people are trying to communicate, and that itself is something which we have to coordinate on. But 3 would be, to understand communication, you can't just use more communication. If we're going to understand communication itself as something a problem in which we need to coordinate, then we can't use communication as the solution to that. We've got to have some other mechanism. And the claim here is that virtual bargaining is sort of crucial to the very existence of human communication. And this is a kind of theory which is essentially a mixture of the philosopher David Lewis's ideas about conventions and Thomas Schelling's ideas about focal points and similar things. They're different in detail, but that's the inspiration. I want to distinguish in particular between communication, as I'm going to use the term, which I think is sort of essential to essentially a human, perhaps distinctively human phenomenon, from signaling, which I'll view as much more broad than that. So here's a case of signaling, just to give you an illustration of how different this is from communication as I'm going to use it. Here's a gazelle, I think it is, stotting. And as you probably know, stotting is this bouncing up and down action that gazelles do when predators are nearby. And it might seem a strange thing to bounce up and down with predators nearby, because you might think your best bet is to just hide or stay as still as possible. But it turns out that bouncing is a pretty good strategy, because what it does is it signals to the lion, I'm a fast, healthy gazelle, no point chasing me. And this is a valid signal, because if you can bounce up and down, you are a fast, healthy gazelle. And indeed, it is no point chasing you, because you'll be able to escape. So the lion doesn't have to waste time chasing you futilely, and you don't have to waste time running pointlessly. So it's a win-win. But the crucial point is this is a signal, not communication. And one reason it's just like it could go on for a long time about what the difference is. But one element is that the signal is genuinely informationally connected to reality. So the bouncing genuinely is, in a sort of information theory sense, it's actually connected to your ability to run quickly and escape the lion. And if it wasn't, then it simply wouldn't work. But another point would be, think about the contrast with the way human communication works. What the human communication strategy would be the following. The gazelle would shout over to the lion, I'm a really fast runner. Don't you even imagine chasing me. You'll never get me. And that would be a completely pointless strategy, because the lion, if it could understand it at all, would think, well, they all say that. But why should I believe it's true? There's no actual information theoretic, as it were, law-like relationship between people saying they're fast runners and being fast runners. But there really is a connection between being a good bouncer, a good stotter, and being a fast runner. And so the lion would view the verbal claim as pure cheap talk, which economists are fond of pointing out as a really endemic problem in theories of communication from a rational point of view. It's just hard to understand why you should take any notice of what people say. You should pay attention to signals, because they've got some validity in terms of their structure of they're relating to the structure of the environment. But mere talk, why is that not just nonsense? We need a different theory of why it is that human communication, language, facial expression, gesture, all of this stuff actually is in some way meaningfully informative. I think it operates completely differently from signaling, which is about, as it were, information theory. It's about connected, lawful connections between states of the world. I want to give you some illustrations of this, and these come from experimental work done with Jennifer Misiak. And Jennifer did these experiments in a much more structured environment than this. So we actually have lots of, so we didn't have pictures of Dr. Watson and Sherlock Holmes, and we don't have, in kind of informal layouts I'll show you in a minute. Everything's done rather carefully with a somewhat virtual reality type of environment. But it's much less clear what's going on. So I'm going to give you very simple stylized examples, but the data are extremely clear. So you'll get the basic logic more clearly this way, I hope. So here's a communication game, and you'll see it's very different from signaling in a moment. So Watson on the left, this is the 1940s Sherlock Holmes films, which are truly terrible, but entertained me as a child. So for the sake of those childhood memories, here they are, Holmes and Watson. And now the key point about them here is they are friends. They're on the same side as each other. And Watson has a blob, and he's going to find that he's got to use the blob to signal to Holmes which of three buckets, which we'll see in a minute, contains a nice thing. And nice things in this paradigm are bananas, and that does not contain a nasty thing. So every bucket has one thing under it. It might be a nice thing, a banana. It might be a nasty thing, a scorpion. So Watson is presented with the buckets, and he can see what's underneath the buckets, and he's got his blob. And he's going to have to put the blob somewhere. Holmes then turns up and thinks, now, what should I pick? He knows there's a banana and two scorpions, but which one's which? Which bucket's which? He has to pick a bucket. Okay. This is not going to be a very hard problem, is it? So, of course, Watson marks the banana, and of course, our subjects do this too. He marks the banana. Holmes turns up, thinks, well, Watson would have marked the banana, surely. Yes, indeed, so he has. Everything's great. Now, that all sounds completely trivial. There is actually quite a lot of complexity underneath it, but it becomes obvious that there is as soon as you make the following subtle change. And this can be done in the very next trial. You can jump back between these two cases, and people immediately flip their behavior. So watch this. So now we have two bananas, and we know we have two bananas, and we know we have one scorpion. So both common knowledge that there's one blob, two bananas, one scorpion. And you can take open as many buckets as you like. Okay, so here's Watson. He puts his blob down. What does that blob mean? Well, I suspect you're already thinking, well, if I were doing it, I'd use the blob to mark the scorpion, because then Holmes can think, well, that's the odd one out. That's the scorpion. So I'll open the other two buckets. But then there we are. Ta-da! Two bananas are retrieved. Now that's the remarkable thing because, and indeed, as I say, it happens from trial to trial. People will flip between these two types of signal. The first signal, remember, was blob means banana, or possibly blob means choose that one. But in this case, there's this tiny change to the stimuli. Now, blob means scorpion, or blob means don't choose this one. And both parties realize this, and they both realize it simultaneously and instantaneously. Not with perfect fidelity, but pretty accurately. Not only that, this is super sophisticated pragmatic reasoning, because it depends on all kinds of things, which a sort of proper theory of reasoning would think it should depend on, and the real empirical data follow this. So, for example, it's crucial that both Watson and Holmes know there are two bananas. If I'm going to use the old inversion trick where I point at the scorpion so that Holmes can get two bananas, that's not going to work if Holmes doesn't know how many bananas or scorpions there are. So if we have a wall, which we do in one version of the experiment, which makes it impossible for Holmes to see the bananas and scorpions, and obvious to Watson that Holmes can't see it, so it's clearly not common knowledge, then the exact same problem we had before is suddenly changed. So now we have our one banana, we have one banana and two scorpions, we point to the banana, and if we had two bananas, I think I've given a slightly wrong example there, if we had two bananas and one scorpion, we'd simply point at the scorpion. So I gave you the easy case rather than the difficult case. But if you had two bananas and one scorpion, once you've got the wall, there it is, the wall, which means that neither it's not common knowledge anymore that there are two bananas, then all that Watson can do is think, well, I'll just point at a bucket with a banana, and Holmes will get one banana. Two bananas becomes impossible to achieve. But there are other switches as well at work, one of which is that if we change the paradigm so that, again, you can do this trial by trial if you want, if you change the paradigm so that both players know that you can only open one bucket, so then immediately Watson just points at one of the bananas. Because the clever trick with the scorpion was that you can get two bananas by pointing at the odd one out. But as soon as you can't open two buckets, then you just point at a single banana. And Holmes opens that box because he knows that too. So that our common knowledge of the best communicative signaling system is continually changing depending on really subtle variations of the situation. And so what's going on here is very much like the case I talked about at the beginning. You're given a problem, and you both have to think, what would we do to solve this problem? Where what we're doing, in fact, is making a mapping between possible messages, i.e. where we're going to put our blob, and possible layouts of the world. So signal meaning mappings. So we're alighting on the one that we think would do best. And since I know that you're thinking this way too, you're thinking, what mapping would we agree on in a situation like this? Then I can use that mapping, and you can use that mapping, and we can agree. We can agree the same convention, and for that reason, we're going to succeed in communicating with each other. I think how different that is from spotting. And here, the meaning of a blob is flipping around from one case to the next in an incredibly flexible way, whereas the spotting always means I'm fast. It doesn't mean anything else, can't mean anything else. Okay, that's communication. Let's think now about collaboration. And the idea of virtual bargaining and collaboration is very straightforward. Well, first of all, you need to have theory of what it means for a bargain to be a good bargain. In communication, we've been dealing with cases where we're always trying to coordinate with each other. So if I think a signal means something and you think it means the same thing, it's good for both of us. We both understand each other. But in general, in coordination problems and collaboration problems, that's not always the case. It may be that I think the plan is such and such, and you think the plan is such and such, but you think, oh, I can get a bit of a personal advantage by not quite following the plan. So if we're going to agree a plan, we need to agree a plan that is a good plan if we follow the plan. But in general, it doesn't arise in the communication case, but in general, we will need it to be a plan that is what I call betrayal-proof, which means that if I follow the plan, you can't profit at my expense, or not much. So the two possibilities I'm worried about if I make a plan with you is I think, well, what will happen if we both do what we say? And we're not really saying anything because it's all virtual, but I imagine us thinking, yeah, the best plan is this. But also I think, yeah, but if you deviate from the plan, if you know that I'm going to follow it, and you deviously do what's best for you, am I still okay? And good plans are stable under both, are successful under both scenarios. So I want to give you an example of this, which is, again, very intuitive, but actually very hard for individualistic theories of reasoning to understand, just as these other points like communication and the game we started with are also very hard for an individualistic point of view. So here's the game, which we call a booby-trap game. So we've got two criminals, or they're just people with no other regarding morality. So they're purely selfish individuals. They don't wish each other harm or wish each other good health, as it were. They just don't care about the other. They just care about themselves and their money. And they both have safes with money in it. In fact, not money, I should say treasure. And the treasure they've gotten by ill-gotten means. No, sorry, though they engage in lives of ill-gotten gain, they've actually got this treasure legitimately. So it's actually worth quite a lot because they have proper title to it. Now, what can happen in this game is that each player can make one of three moves. One move is that they don't do anything, not very exciting move, it's a null move. Another move is that, we'll take the bottom case, we'll come to the middle one in a moment. The bottom one is that they steal from the other person's safe. So they nip across to the other person's house and steal from their safe. And they can potentially both steal from each other's safe simultaneously. Now, if they do that, you might think, well, that's kind of a draw, really, because they've both got treasure. They've just got the other person's treasure. But that's not right in this imaginary scenario, because now they haven't got legal title to the treasure. So they have to sell it on the black market or melt it down. So it's worth a lot less. So really, they don't want to swap treasure, because then they both lose a lot. But there's another thing they can do, the middle option, which is they can buy a booby trap, see booby fired by this rather implausible-looking bomb, and they can pop the booby trap on their safe, so that if the other criminal comes along and tries to steal it, then both the criminal gets blown up, but also, of course, all the treasure gets blown up too. So there's no real advantage for either of them if the safe is actually attacked, but the idea is it's a kind of precaution. That seems incredibly natural and intuitive, but according to standard individualistic reasoning embodied in Nash equilibrium or the evolutionary stable strategy in evolutionary game theory, but any kind of individualistic perspective, is that the booby trap really is not credible and it costs money, so no one's ever going to play it, so we can ignore it. What's the logic here? Well, the logic is I'm worried about my, I want to get the best outcome I can. If you come and steal my safe, for money from my safe, if I put a booby trap on it, you get blown up and I lose my treasure. If I didn't put a booby trap on it, I lose my treasure anyway. So it doesn't really make any difference. I've just wasted my money on this booby trap. And you reason the same way. You think, well, there's no point buying one because it makes no difference to my outcome whether I had the booby trap or not. Of course, it makes a difference to you, but I don't care about you. I just care about me. So the idea is that, according to this approach, this viewpoint, the booby trap is totally non-credible. Both players essentially defect in a prisoner's dilemma sense. They rush across, steal the other person's safe, and they end up with a pile of treasure, which is not much use to them. So it's kind of a bad situation because they started off with treasure they owned, and now they end up with a pile of not very valuable treasure. Damn, that's not a good solution. They have this booby trap. It seems like that should solve the problem, but it somehow doesn't, according to these very individualistic perspectives on reasoning. But virtual bargaining solves that problem. So what virtual bargaining says is, well, imagine these gangsters could agree. And remember, there's no question of love for each other or common fate or anything of this kind, common purpose. These are totally selfish individuals. But just imagine they could bargain. It would be quite a hostile bargain. And each gangster would be saying, don't you imagine, for a second, I'm not buying a booby trap. In fact, I'm going down to the booby trap store right now, and I'm putting it on my safe. And the other one would say the same. And if one of them said, well, I just don't believe it's a credible threat, I bet you're not really going to buy it, you're going to save your money, they'd absolutely insist that they would. So the agreement they come to would be, we're going to buy the booby trap. Now think about what I said earlier about what makes a good agreement. If it's the case that they both follow this agreement, that's good news, because they spend money on a cheap booby trap and they keep their own treasure. Fantastic, no stealing occurs. But on the other hand, supposing I buy the booby trap, and like a muggins, you don't follow the rule, and I'm left thinking, well, I followed my part of the bargain, but you didn't. So what do you do? What do you do if you don't follow the bargain? Well, you know I bought the booby trap because I followed my part of the agreement, and you think, I won't follow the agreement. I'll save my money. So I saved, like, I don't know, $2 on a booby trap. Well, that's fine. I mean, the first person doesn't care at all about that because they still didn't get their treasure stolen. So the best response in this, so the best thing you can do if you're trying to betray, in this case, is just not buy the booby trap. So the other person isn't harmed. I don't mind being betrayed, but quotes, betrayal just means I'm not totally unharmed, but here I am, I'm totally unharmed. I still got my treasure, that's fine. So this is why it's a viable agreement. We can both follow that agreement. If we both follow the agreement, it's good news. If one of us quote betrays the other, doesn't really matter. We're fine. So I'm happy to sign up to that. And just as I'd be happy to sign up to that as a real agreement, I'm going to be happy to sign up to it as a virtual agreement. And the weird thing is that this is not an Nash equilibrium. It's not, from an individualistic reasoning point of view, not really a viable equilibrium because of the argument I gave before. But that's not the way we reason. We're reasoning about us. We're not reasoning about what should I do based on what you should do. I'm thinking about what should we do. It's a completely different notional type of thinking. I won't go into the details of all the actual experiments we did on this, but the basic concept is we put this into a matrix. It's always much messier and less clear when you actually take the story away, and of course the participants only see the matrix. We turn this into a prisoner's dilemma with an extra move called Boobytrap. I won't take you through the numbers, but you've got to cooperate and defect, the famous prisoner's dilemma, where famously individualistic agents will always play defects. And now we add this extra move, Boobytrap, and actually. The question is, do people actually play the Boobytrap? They don't have the cover story. They just play the boring old numbers. Now, the thing about the Boobytrap, remember, is that if I buy the Boobytrap, your best move is just to cooperate, be nice. Don't try and steal my treasure. So the price of defection is very, very minimal for me. You can save money on your Boobytrap. It doesn't matter to me. So we should be able to get a really good outcome, almost as good as cooperate. In the Boobytrap case, according to individualistic reasoning, that should just be an impossibility. But in fact, of course, people do it. Now, in practice, you can save a bit. You can do a bit better, actually. You don't need to buy the Boobytrap all the time. You just need an agreement which says, "I'll buy the Boobytrap to a certain extent, and I'll buy it with a certain probability, just great enough to deter you, because you don't want to be blown up by my Boobytrap. So as long as I buy it with a certain probability, you will actually be sufficiently deterred." So the prediction of the theory isn't actually that people always buy the Boobytrap, it's that they buy it with a certain probability, fairly small. So what happens in practice? Well, there's the only experimental data I'm going to show you on this, but let's look at some very simple results from the paper. So on the left-hand graphs are what happens if we just have two options. We don't have cooperate and defect, as in normal prisoner's dilemma. We have cooperate and Boobytrap. So here there's no point buying, so these are the only options, no point buying a Boobytrap because no one can steal anyway. No one can only cooperate or buy a Boobytrap, don't bother to buy the Boobytrap. Waste of money, as it were. But let's now try, take the Boobytrap away and just have cooperate and defect. So we've got a normal prisoner's dilemma. And yep, you get defection almost all the time. So that's pretty bad. But what happens if we have all three options? So we've got cooperate, defect, and the Boobytrap. And suddenly cooperate shoots up. The Boobytrap occurs about a third to a quarter of the time. Actually, that's slightly more, a bit more Boobytrap buying than is needed. And you do get a little defection, though not very much. And that's almost all in the first part of the experiment. So people play this game against different individuals in sort of random repairings. And initially, a bit of defection goes on, but people soon realize that's not a good idea. So defection gets rapidly eliminated. So we've got a cooperative outcome based on the fact that we can make this kind of agreement, an agreement in which we say, I'm going to buy this Boobytrap, I'm going to stop you, or I might do it with a certain probability, that will stop your evil ways. And this is true, of course, underpinning agreements regarding threats of all kinds. Most of the time when you make a threat, it's actually quite a bad thing to exercise the threat. So if you say, if you do this, I'll fight you, not usually a good idea, but fighting is generally bad for both parties. You really don't want to have to do that. But of course, a lot of agreements work because there's that sense of, but if you don't agree, don't do what you said, or if I don't do what I said, then I retaliate. And this kind of logic is telling you why that actually can work. Because standard individualistic reasoning would say, well, people are never really going to retaliate, are they? It's not in their best interest. Once I've done the bad thing, it's too late. Unless you think there's going to be a further interaction, but that's often not the case. There's a totally different kind of logic, which is saying we're making agreements with each other, and those agreements include essentially credible threats. Let me give you an example of this in a slightly more real world, not very, but a slightly more real world context, which is what we call the gas station problem. And this is a problem which was inspired by an example of Bob Sugden, economist at University of East Anglia, in the context of taxi. Why does anyone pay a cab? So it's just a variation of Bob's example. So you're on a lonely road, a driver appears at as a petrol station, there's only the two of you, no one to observe, and you're going to exchange fuel for money. And the question is, can you actually do this beneficially? Now, in principle, it sounds like it ought to be great, but the danger is that one person gives the other the fuel and then they just drive off, or possibly I give the money first, and then the person says, "Oh, well, I've got your money now. Why should I give you any gas?" So how is it possible that for unobserved transactions we can actually interact successfully? It's very, very close, not the same, but very close to the example we just talked about. So I think just to make it clear why this is such a hard problem for most theories of reasoning to deal with, and certainly most game theoretic approaches, but just generally, it's kind of really puzzling if you don't think using some kind of virtual bargaining type of mindset, is that there are two kinds of cases. There are two kinds of cases where we are roughly symmetrical creatures. So imagine we're very primitive kind of characters, and all we ever do is we either do what we ought to do, or if there's a violation, we have a fight. This primitive world we're living in here. So imagine that we're relatively symmetrical. So we're both gorillas, and we're both pretty scary. And if we're both pretty scary gorillas, fighting each other is really bad for both of us. We're probably both going to get really badly hurt. So in principle, we could say, well, I'm going to give you some money, and I'm expecting some gas. And if I don't get gas, I'm going to fight you. And according to the type of logic we were talking about before, that should be totally non-credible. Once I've given the money away, it's all over, because the other person will say, well, you said you were going to fight me, but I mean, you're not, are you? Because you lost your money now. And fighting's bad for both of us, so that's it. So there's never going to be a transaction under those circumstances, because whoever makes the first move and hands over the money or hands over the gas knows they're never going to get anything back. But also imagine the asymmetrical case. So you imagine you're not of unequal strength. So there's a gorilla and a koala here. The trouble with this strategy is that the gorilla can certainly hand over the cash and expect the koala to produce some gas. Yes, because if the koala doesn't, then the gorilla can fight the koala, and the gorilla will not get injured, but the poor old koala certainly will do. But on the other hand, the gorilla doesn't have to hand over the money. They can just force the koala to give them the gas anyway. Right? Because if fighting's easy, then you can just threaten fighting and get what you want in the first place. So there's still no way of getting a mutually beneficial transaction. So according to this view, there should be no lonely gas station transactions at all, because if you're not observed, you just can't successfully, under any circumstances, engage in a sequential exchange. I give you something, you give me something back. You might think, but this is a slightly unusual case because we're in a lonely gas station and there's no one to talk to. But actually, as soon as a bad thing happened to me, I'd rush off and complain. So if somebody didn't pay me for my gas, I'd ring around all the other gas stations and say, "Don't talk to this guy. He's not trustworthy. He's in a red Chevrolet or something." But of course, that was completely wrong as well from an individualistic point of view. Because if you're an individualistic agent, and you're not thinking from a point of view of how you should behave collectively, you're just thinking about your own individual payoffs. If it pays you to complain about somebody, it'll pay you to complain about them, whether or not they did a bad thing. So it doesn't matter whether they actually were mean or not. The question is, should you complain? And that is independent of what they actually did, unfortunately. So you have it's another cheap talk problem, as you can imagine. So actually, unobserved interactions can't occur even when you have communication and reputational issues, because reputation only makes sense when people can be trusted to be reliable. Okay. The virtual bargaining story gives you a simple betrayal-proof implicit agreement, which does solve the problem. You say, if the driver pays, A provides the fuel, attendant. If the attendant provides the fuel, the driver pays. And if either violates these rules, the other escalates to some mutually disadvantageous conflict. And if we both follow these rules, it's all good. If one of us, and we both have a mutually successful transaction, but if one of us, what's the best response? If one of us decides, I'm not really interested in following the rule, I'll just do the thing that's best for me. Actually, the best thing for you is to follow the rule, because if you don't follow it, you'll get attacked. Or at least that's what the rule says. You don't know that the other person will follow it, but that's what it says. So if you decide to violate the rules, you should expect to be attacked, and that's what's actually going to stop you. And I think there's an incredibly powerful human motivation to enforce these implicit agreements. If we have an implicit agreement which essentially says, if you try to steal from me, I'm going to get very angry and conflict will arise, then I've got a very strong incentive to engage in that conflict, and I have, or I have a very strong tendency to do it. irrespective of, as it were, pure individualistic considerations. What I'm doing is enforcing the bargain. So I'm thinking, we had this agreement, and I'm jolly well going to follow the agreement. And the agreement was, you can't get away with that. I'm going to escalate. Okay. And indeed, whenever bargain in general is violated, we may feel, and often do feel, outrage. So I might make the wild claim that I think actually quite a lot of moral emotions, not all, but quite a few, are actually about virtual or indeed sometimes real bargains. They're not really about actions at all. So if you get bitten, for example, by a shark, which certainly seems like an action from the shark, it doesn't really make sense to be angry with the shark. You might be frightened, you might be fearful of the shark or horrified, but being angry is kind of a mistake, because the shark never made an agreement with you. It didn't say, implicitly or otherwise, you just swim there happily, it'll be absolutely fine, I won't bite you. In fact, if you imagine such a dialogue with the shark would absolutely be saying, no, I'll bite you, I'm a shark, that's just what I do. And therefore, anger is an inappropriate emotion. Now, of course, we might feel it anyway, because we do anthropomorphize, but somehow it's sort of fundamentally a mistake. And similarly, you could say the same thing about anger at earthquakes or other inanimate forces in the world. Just briefly, I'm going to be quite speedy on the social contract in miniatures. I think we've got the kind of general points, but the whole concept of virtual bargaining is very familiar if you've looked at the literature in political philosophy about the origins of the sort of implicit social contract that we adhere to as citizens. So the idea is that, from people like Hobbes and Rousseau and more recently John Rawls, that the rules that govern society are a kind of implicit agreement that we adopt by being part of that society. Of course, some are codified in actual laws, but we're implicitly buying into those and saying, yeah, I as a citizen will follow these rules, and I will be told to do, in the case of Hobbes, I'll be told to do what my king says, or whatever the political structure I'm living within is, and I'll do that for my own benefit, because this is something I would agree to, because it's good for us. It will be good for us all, and in particular for me. So we basically are thinking, how would we agree to run our society? This seems like a reasonable agreement. Now, some ways of running society seem better than others, so we may not actually agree with the way our society is being run, in which case we may want to violate those agreements. But nonetheless, the idea is that a well-functioning society is one where the members are implicitly agree to the principles that organize that society. And these principles involve rights and responsibilities and roles. We will have different roles to play, different things we're responsible for, and different rights in terms of the way we expect to be treated by others. And a contract is legitimate if we would agree to it. So the social contract in miniature, which is really virtual bargaining, is the same thing we've just talked about, but just scaled down. So the left-hand list is just scaling down to saying, when we make an individual interaction, so I exchange some gas for some money, or we communicate in some way, or we make some kind of strange set of choices with ones and zeros, or bananas and scorpions, we're making an implicit agreement, and it's a sensible. That agreement has rights and responsibilities and roles. So it may be that I'm supposed to do one thing, you're supposed to do another thing, and the contract is operative if we would agree to it. So I'm trying to simulate, when I'm reasoning about what to do in these situations, I'm trying to simulate what would we agree to do here. Just to say a little bit about roles. So imagine we're in the following situation. We've got this is a plan view of two people standing over a table that they've got to move. And to move it, they've got one to stand at one end and one to stand at the other end. And both are quite lazy and don't like walking very far. So both of the yellow and blue there, would really like to go towards the left end of the table, because they're slightly over to the left anyway. But of course, blue, reasoning sensibly, would think, well, I mean, really, realistically, I'm not going to be the one to go to the left end, am I? Because then yellow has to go all the way around. So that's the bottom scenario on the right there. So there's an efficient strategy that we would agree to. And the efficient strategy is that annoying though it is, actually, I'm not that far away from the right-hand end of the table, so I'll go there. And yellow, luckily for them, just has a very, very short walk indeed. And then we pick up the table and off we go. So the idea here is that we don't have to have a long discussion about this. We don't have to fight about it. We don't have to do any toing or froing. It's completely obvious to both of us that there are two strategies here which will work, but just one's more long-winded and painful than the other. If we could discuss it, it's obvious we choose the simple one, the more efficient one, we'll just do that. However, it's not so straightforward if we have differences in power. So this is where roles start to matter. So imagine one of us is a despot and the other is a servant. And despots don't like moving tables around, but they don't like moving tables around involving lots of walking, and the servant knows this. And the despot and the servant reason completely differently. So the servant and despot both know that if they were to discuss what they were going to do here, the despot would say, well, you go to the far end, and I'll just make this short move to the left, because the despot is after all the despot. And so the servant just gets on and does it. The servant rushes round the despot in the lower diagram here and dashes to the other end of the table, and the despot just idly potters to the left and gets into position. And they don't have to talk about this either. And if they did have to interact about it, it would be viewed as extremely annoying for the despot and bad news for the servant. The point is that successful social interaction may not actually be efficient. The point is we do what we would agree to do. And if one person's a despot and they would call the shots, then we agree to do that. So whatever factors affect real bargaining will affect virtual bargaining too, including here status. I think I might skip a formal theory because I've said all the informal stuff, and the formal theory is just succinct. And I want to finish with a couple of minutes on how you might think of this as connecting to an informal theory of culture. So what I've said so far is purely focused on creating conventions in the moment. So, and I want to stress the incredible flexibility of this, the fact that in communication and collaboration, we're able to generate and improvise jointly plans, conventions that will actually allow us to interact. And if you change the situation slightly, change the status, change the information, change what's common knowledge, we'll flip our behavior as easy as that without noticing how sophisticated and clever that is. So you might think, well, this isn't anything to do with culture. This is all about improvisation. Culture is the stable stuff. Culture is the sort of norms and sort of stable machinery over which we operate, conventions which are not made up in the moment, but conventions that are stable. But I want to argue that you could think of those conventions as arising through lots of layers of improvisation. So, of course, social contract in its full extent, this is going back to the Hobbesian vision, is a complex thing with norms, conventions, customs, laws, rights, institutions, culture of all kinds. How could this emerge? Clearly not from nothing. But the idea would be that culture accumulates rather like the accumulation of case law. So a cultural tradition is a layering of one agreement on top of another. So when we have, I make an agreement one day to refer to a scorpion using a particular word, or to use a blob to point to a particular kind of object, and probably tomorrow we'll use that same agreement again. We might not. There might be a better way of using things, using our communicative machinery, but probably we'll stick, other things being equal to the convention we had yesterday. And once we've done that a few times, what was initially an improvisation turns out into a stable convention. So we have a layering of what I think of as sort of local, intelligent, creative design. And that's extrapolating, allowing us to extrapolate from past precedents, not just to focus on the here and now. So you should think really of the basic units of culture from this point of view as being precedent from past cases. But the way we're using past cases is always improvised, always thinking of the cleverest way to use those past cases and the specifics of the current situation to create a new precedent. And that precedent will be used to create further precedents. So you should imagine the world of precedents, norms, and conventions as a bit like the structure of a coral reef, from which each polyp is building on the polyps below. So the idea is that when you think about language and customs and conventions in a grand scale, maybe we need an incremental theory of how they come to be, which is based on flexible improvisation, virtual agreements, but these flexible improvisations become canalized and standardized, but always still flexible. I think language is a particularly interesting case here. So momentary communication, this is work that I've done with Morton Christensen, but also fits very, very naturally into the construction grammar tradition that Goldberg and many others have worked so much on. So the idea would be that communicative interaction set down the precedent for future communicative behavior, creating gradually fairly stable lexicons and grammar. But the order in grammar is like the order in a legal system. It's piecemeal, it's partial, it's not a perfect logical system, and it never will be. And that's because it's grown up from the bottom up. Each new case is being decided on the basis of past cases, but the different cases will not necessarily integrate to produce a perfectly transparent system. And of course, we should also allow the possibility that we may want to codify and make it completely explicit rules, and we often do. So if you think about the law itself, there are all these informal arrangements that people have had throughout history about governing their interactions, but sometimes they want to write them down, particularly when they're complicated or they're not agreed. And similarly with things like the rules of the different variations of football. Initially, very informal games become increasingly formalized. You could say the same about the emergence of economic institutions as well. So we're forced to make virtual bargains explicit when there are disputes and uncertainties. But we never make these bargains entirely explicit, of course. There's, the open-ended nature of the law, the open-ended nature of the rules of football and soccer. These are all examples of how this process of formalization never completely occurs. So the big picture is that we want to see culture as arising from every new virtual bargaining being based on past precedent, perhaps explicit cultural forms, and really codifications of earlier virtual bargains. So that's where laws and languages and sports and so on are coming from. Rules of sports are coming from. They're being created by a plethora of improvised local bargains, which gradually create incrementally the complex social structures we have. So I want to have a theory of culture which says that it arises incrementally through layers of virtual agreements. So that's it. I'd be very happy to take any questions. But the take-home message, I suppose, in a sentence, is to think we want to. The cognitive science, psychology often thinks from a very individualistic perspective. But as soon as we switch to thinking of ourselves as engaged, thinking about us, we have to have an understanding of where us comes from. What are we? What would we agree in this situation? And I think thinking about bargaining is really important. It's where the thoughts and behaviours of the mysterious we that as it were overshadows our behaviour comes from this sense of, well, if we could talk, we could get together and make a decision about what to do. That's what we do, and that thought can involve all kinds of creativity, all kinds of flexibility, but ultimately it's that idea of what we would agree to do that's driving all sorts of aspects of social behaviour. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. So we do have a few minutes for questions. I know that there are some questions coming in now in the Ask a Question sort of tab. Nick, I don't know if you know how to access that. If you want, I can read out the questions as well. But
yeah,
maybe
if you want to read them out, that would be good.
Okay, that'll be our bargain. So Scott, whose last name isn't here, but he asks, do you think that variability and sensitivity to violation of virtual bargains contributes to psychopathology?
Oh yeah, that's a very interesting question, isn't it? I don't know the answer to that. It's quite possible. I think sensitivity to the ability to form virtual bargains, I think, is a very important point of individual difference. I think some people are going to be much better at this than others, and it's a very difficult thing to do because working out what bargain we're going to form requires understanding the situation, but also requires understanding what common knowledge we have. So we have to understand the other person quite well to know what that common knowledge is. But I think so. One individual difference is about that conceptual ability. But there may be other things too. So it may be that some people are much less happy to have virtual bargains violated than others, and others are much more relaxed. And I suspect that's a pretty major dimension of personality, actually. But I haven't thought much about this, and it's something I should ponder a lot more. But it's a very good question.
So we have a couple of others, and again, for the audience, please feel free to post your questions and vote on the questions. That's, I think, one of the benefits of these sort of online interfaces. Okay, so Kenji Kobayashi asks, what would give rise to systematic individual differences in your framework? What about cultural differences? I suppose you commented on part of this with your personality.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I haven't got a good answer to that. The general story about individual differences in this kind of rational framework is that there has to be some kind of mixed strategy equilibrium going on. Because the normal story would be if one way of bargaining or one way of interacting is better than another, then we'll all do it pretty soon. But so we'll just, as it were, the best strategy will always out. But if it turns out that and in most theories of interaction, that's not. This is the case. If it turns out that if we all do one thing, then it becomes advantageous to do some other thing, and vice versa. Then the equilibrium strategy will be a mixture. So this is true in much simpler cases, sort of hawk-dove kind of interactions. And so if we have hawks and doves, hawks will do very well because they chase the doves away. But on the other hand, if we have lots of hawks, they keep fighting each other and with terrible, mutually disastrous results. So you get a mixed strategy equilibrium with some hawks and some doves. And I think that kind of thing translates into a virtual bargaining story too. So I think I have to take a view which says, if everyone, it's something very much like the hawks-doves scenario. If most people are really nice, good virtual bargainers, then there's going to be a few meanies who profit by this. But then we're going to be mean to the meanies. But there'll still be there'll still be there'll still be an equilibrium where not everybody's nice. So I mean that's a very, very abstract sort of answer. But I think that has to be the right kind of story, unless you think we're out of equilibrium. But I think the natural assumption would be we've been around for long enough that probably the variety of different crazy strategies people use to interact with each other are all pretty evolutionarily stable.
We have time for at least one or two more questions. Dan Swingley asks, people would need to agree about how to decide which conventions to apply in new cases. So isn't this coordination part of the hard part in the case of language?
Well, I think I think the puzzling thing is that people really do seem to agree pretty well. So in the case of these sort of very primitive examples I gave of the bananas and scorpions, it's amazing how well people can do this task. And I suppose it's very similar to questions about how people interpret pronouns or how people interpret names in contexts where we all know lots of people called John, but we happen to be in a particular situation where referring to John obviously means this particular John or whatever. I mean, we're really, really super good at this, and it's a puzzling thing that we are. But I think that's it's sort of a clear sort of fact to be explained really. And I mean, the virtual bargaining story is trying to give you some of the logic behind that, but it doesn't go from nothing. I mean, it requires either common knowledge. So we have to have common knowledge that this is somehow, for some reason, the most salient John in the situation, or possibly sometimes common processing machinery. So it might be that when I say, look at that, that I can rely on the fact that we both have, if there's a firework just gone off, say, we both have a common perceptual machinery which will alight on a fast-moving, exploding object. So we don't actually have to have common knowledge of that. We just have to have a common system. So the division between those two cases, I think, is quite tricky, because one, you're sort of imagining that there's a rational explanation for why we're coordinating. The other one, you're assuming that because we're built the same way, we're automatic coordinators. So Morten and I have talked a lot in the past about how agreeing to coordinate is quite easy to the extent that we're the same, because what occurs to me as a sensible thing to do is what occurs to you, because we're the same. And so that's very helpful, but of course that only solves some easy problems. But yeah, it's a very deep set of questions, of course.
Well, we are basically at 1 p.m. We're out of time. I did actually post a question myself, but obviously you and I can chat about it offline. So I think I'll just end the meeting here. Thank you once again, Nick, for coming, and thank you to the audience for joining us as well. Heather,
thank you very much, everybody. Yeah, very, very interested to hear any thoughts that anyone has afterwards. If you just drop me an email. It's very, very, very good to have your attention, and yeah, hope it's useful.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Just for our audience, this is the last talk of this semester. We'll be back in February, so stay tuned. We will post the events here, but you're also welcome to just go to our website, and I can post a link for it. We're MindCORE at Penn. Sudeep, thank you very much as well. To both of you, have a good weekend.
All right, well, thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.